Now you will learn something that you were not taught in history class at school. I will tell you about 9 homemade vehicles and means of transport used by soldiers during World War II, and it will definitely change your perception of this period. Usually, when we talk about World War II, we imagine giant factories working non-stop and endless conveyor belts producing tanks and airplanes. We think about the power of industry and the genius of great designers. But there was another war, a quiet, invisible one, fought in trenches, forests, and besieged cities. It was a war of soldierly ingenuity, where ordinary fighters became engineers, and handy scrap became a resource for creating amazing machines. In these inhuman conditions, inventions were born that were striking in their simplicity and effectiveness. Heroism was manifested not only in attacks, but also in the quiet, daily struggle against circumstances. These homemade machines did not decide the outcome of global battles, but they saved lives, performed impossible tasks, and became a symbol of the indomitable human spirit. This is a story about how the will to win turned ordinary tractors, trucks, and even water pipes into formidable weapons. Watch the video to the end to find out how an ordinary farm tractor became one of the most unusual psychological weapons on the Eastern Front. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of trench engineering. In the summer of 1941, a desperate situation arose in besieged Odessa. The city lacked tanks to repel Romanian attacks, and then one of the most daring ideas of the entire war was born: to create a tank from whatever was at hand.
Stay alert!
The basis for these improvised combat vehicles was the ordinary STZ, the agricultural crawler tractors. They had no armor or weapons, but they did have a reliable chassis. The workers at the Andrei Marty ship repair plant took on what seemed like an impossible task. They began to install homemade armor on the tractors. Everything was used: boiler steel sheets, ship steel, and sometimes even several layers of ordinary steel with rubber or boards laid between them. This multi-layered protection was supposed to at least somehow protect the crew from bullets and shrapnel. The weapons were as improvised as the armor. Some vehicles were equipped with machine guns and homemade turrets. Others were equipped with light mountain guns or even dummy heavy guns to intimidate the enemy. A total of about 60-70 such vehicles were built. They were not real tanks. Their armor was weak and their armament was insufficient. But their main effect was not in their firepower, but in their psychological impact. Outwardly, these machines looked rough and intimidating. At night, in the light of searchlights and under the deafening roar of engines, a column of such tanks made a stunning impression on the enemy. Romanian soldiers, who did not expect to see such a large number of armored vehicles among the city's defenders, often retreated. The soldiers nicknamed these machines NI-1, which stood for Na Ispug, to frighten. This name perfectly reflected their main tactical task. They were not so much a real weapon as a psychological one, a demonstration that the city was not going to surrender. The story of these ersatz tanks is a hymn to ingenuity and courage in the most hopeless conditions. It shows how people deprived of resources use their main assets, their minds and their will to resist. They proved that sometimes faith and ingenuity can be stronger than factory-made armor. The creation of such a machine was an act of desperation, but at the same time one of incredible courage. It became a symbol of the defense of Odessa, a monument to those who were ready to fight to the end, using any means available. This experience showed that war is not only a clash of armies, but also a battle of minds. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think about this manifestation of engineering ingenuity in a critical situation? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about how an ordinary Jeep was turned into a Special Forces weapon? One of the most unusual units of the British Army, the Popski's Private Army, operated in the sands of North Africa and on the roads of Italy. Their main weapon at home was the legendary American Willis Jeep, which the soldiers turned into a true masterpiece of field modification. The standard Jeep was an excellent vehicle, but it was not suitable for deep raids behind enemy lines. It lacked the range, armament, and ability to carry everything necessary for autonomous life in the desert. The soldiers of Major Vladimir Penyakov, known as Popsky, solved this problem with their characteristic ingenuity. First, they significantly increased the fuel capacity. Additional gasoline cans were attached everywhere, on the sides, on the hood, on the rear bumper. This allowed them to cover hundreds of kilometers through enemy territory without refueling. The Jeep's armament was impressive for such a small vehicle. Twin air-cooled Vickers K machine guns were mounted in front of the passenger seat. Another machine gun of the same type, and sometimes a large-caliber Browning M2, was mounted on a special turret at the rear of the body. The vehicles were overloaded with equipment. They were fitted with water canisters, boxes of ammunition, provisions, explosives, and spare parts. Every centimeter of space was used to maximum efficiency, turning the Jeep into a mobile commando base. To cope with the enormous weight, the standard suspension was reinforced. Additional spring leaves were installed, which made the vehicle stiffer but allowed it to withstand enormous loads. Wider aircraft tires were often used for better traction on sand. Everything unnecessary that could add weight was removed from the Jeeps. The windshield, which caused glare and could break, was removed, and sometimes the massive radiator grille was replaced with a simple mesh. Everything was done to increase mobility and combat effectiveness. Each Jeep was unique and reflected the preferences of its crew of 2 or 3 people. Soldiers installed additional headlights, sirens, compasses, and even homemade instruments for navigating by the stars on their vehicles. These were not just machines, but true comrades in arms. These modified Jeeps allowed Popsky's army to operate like desert pirates. They would suddenly appear where they were not expected, strike airfields, warehouses, and supply convoys, and then disappear just as quickly into the endless sands. It was a hit-and-run tactic perfected to perfection. Raids in the desert were one thing, but how to storm the most fortified beaches in history? For this, the British needed something much stranger, and in the next chapter, you will learn about the bizarre menagerie of Hobart's toys. What I am about to show you is banned in 12 countries. In the run-up to the Normandy landings, the Allied command faced a serious problem. The German Atlantic Wall was littered with minefields, concrete fortifications, and anti-tank ditches, and a frontal assault threatened to result in horrific losses. The solution was found not in the creation of a new tank, but in the ingenious modification of existing ones. Major General Percy Hobart and his 79th Armored Division created a whole series of specialized engineering vehicles, which the soldiers nicknamed Hobart's Funnies for their unusual and sometimes absurd appearance. One of the most famous toys was the Sherman Crab Tank Destroyer. A special frame with a rotating drum was installed on the front of the tank. Dozens of heavy steel chains were attached to the drum. While moving, the drum rotated at high speed, and the chains pounded the ground in front of the tank. The impact of the chains detonated anti-tank mines at a safe distance. In this way, the Crab cleared a safe passage through minefields for advancing infantry and equipment. Another amazing machine was a bridge layer based on the Churchill tank. This tank carried a 10-meter folding bridge capable of supporting up to 40 tons. Approaching an anti-tank ditch or river, it could set up a crossing in a matter of minutes without requiring the crew to leave the vehicle. The Churchill AVRI, or Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, was created to destroy concrete pillboxes. Instead of a standard gun, it was armed with a 290mm petard mortar. It fired an 18-kilogram shell, which soldiers called a flying trash can. Hobart's toys became a striking example of unconventional military thinking. They proved that sometimes solving a complex problem requires not more guns, but more ingenuity. These strange machines changed the approach to assault operations and became the harbingers of modern engineering technology. What if everything you've been taught is outdated? When the German army invaded the USSR in the summer of 1941, it was confident in its Blitzkrieg plan. However, in the fall, the rains began, and the famous German roads were replaced by Russian mud. Thousands of trucks and tractors got hopelessly stuck in the mud, paralyzing supplies. Conventional wheeled vehicles were completely helpless in the sea of mud. The Wehrmacht faced a logistical disaster. It was then that German soldiers and engineers in field workshops began to look for a solution, and it turned out to be ingeniously simple. They decided to cross a conventional truck with a tracked tractor. The rear axle with wheels was removed from trucks such as the Opel Blitz or Mercedes-Benz. In its place, a tracked bogie from light tanks or tractors was installed. This hybrid was named Maltier, which translates as mule. The name was perfectly suited to this durable and unpretentious machine. The mules had the cross-country ability of a tracked tractor, while retaining the simplicity and low cost of a truck. The first Maltiers were the result of purely field creativity. The designs varied depending on the trucks and tracked chassis available. But the idea proved so successful that the German command soon set up mass production. The Maltiers became the real workhorses of the Eastern Front. They delivered ammunition and food and evacuated the wounded where no wheeled vehicle could pass. Their ability to move through deep snow and mud saved many German units from destruction. Combat vehicles were also created on the basis of the Maltier. Anti-aircraft guns, anti-tank guns, and even rocket mortars were installed on them. The result was a cheap and mobile platform for fire support. But if the Germans modified trucks to cross mud, what did the partisans build to disrupt the supply lines along which these trucks traveled? In the next chapter, we will look at their amazing railway creations. Ready to learn more? A unique war was unfolding in the forests of Belarus and Yugoslavia. Partisan units were constantly fighting on enemy communications, blowing up bridges and derailing trains. To increase the effectiveness of their attacks, they needed mobile and protected transport capable of moving on railways. This gave rise to the idea of creating improvised armored rail cars and armored trains. They were assembled in forest workshops from whatever could be found or captured from the enemy. Ordinary railway platforms or even rail cars used for track repairs often served as the basis. Homemade armored hulls were installed on these platforms. The armor was made from steel sheets taken from damaged equipment, or the same layer cake technology was used as in the Odessa tanks Ne Ispug for scare. The main task was to protect the soldiers from bullets and shrapnel. The weapons were very diverse. Captured machine guns, mortars, and even light cannons removed from damaged tanks were used. Often, several machine guns were installed on the armored platforms to create a high density of fire. The driving force behind these trains was either a small steam locomotive or a powerful car engine adapted to rotate the wheel sets. Sometimes the partisans managed to capture and armor a full-fledged shunting locomotive, turning it into the heart of a real armored train. The crews of these forest fortresses on wheels were the elite of the partisan detachments. They carried out daring raids on small railway stations, destroying guards and warehouses. After the attack, such an armored train quickly withdrew to its secret base in the forest. The history of these homemade armored trains is another page in the chronicle of soldiers' ingenuity. It proves that huge factories are not always necessary for effective combat. Sometimes all it takes is a few skilled hands, an old platform, and unwavering determination. Are you ready for the shocking truth? In the summer of 1944, as Soviet troops approached Warsaw, an uprising broke out in the city. The Home Army soldiers, poorly armed but full of determination, engaged in battle with the German garrison. In street fighting, they desperately lacked armored vehicles. Under these conditions, in the very center of the besieged city, on the territory of a car repair shop, one of the most famous symbols of the Warsaw Uprising was born: the improvised armored car Kubus. It was created in just 13 days, working day and night under constant shelling. The chassis of a 3-ton Chevrolet truck served as the basis for the vehicle. A group of engineers and workers led by Valerian Belsky installed a completely homemade armored hull on this chassis. It was welded from steel sheets and had rational angles of inclination to increase protection. The design was thought out to the smallest detail. It could accommodate up to 12 paratroopers inside. Embrasures were cut into the sides for firing. The crew consisted of a commander, a driver, and 2 machine gunners. The Kubus was armed with a Soviet DP-27 machine gun mounted in the front plate and a homemade flamethrower. This combination made it an effective weapon in close combat on narrow city streets. It could support infantry attacks by suppressing enemy firing points. The vehicle was named Kubus in honor of the deceased wife of one of its designers. This gave the cold metal a human dimension, turning the armored vehicle into an avenger and protector. It was not just a machine, but the embodiment of the spirit of the rebels. Kubus was designed for city streets. But what did the soldiers do when there were no roads or rails? In the next chapter, we will see how they crossed one of the widest rivers in Europe with virtually nothing. Crossing a wide water barrier under enemy fire is one of the most difficult military operations. In the fall of 1943, Soviet troops had to cross the Dnieper River. There was a catastrophic shortage of standard crossing equipment, and once again, the soldiers' ingenuity came to the rescue. The soldiers began to build crossing equipment from whatever they could find on the war-ravaged shore. They used empty fuel barrels, boards from destroyed houses, logs, gates, and even wickets. From this rubbish, they created rafts of the most unimaginable designs. 2 or 3 barrels were tied together and covered with wooden planks. The result was a small but fairly stable raft, capable of carrying several soldiers with weapons or boxes of ammunition. They rode with planks, rifle butts, or simply their hands. When even this was not available, the soldiers resorted to even more surprising methods. They made small rafts out of raincoats, stuffing them with straw, hay, or dry leaves. Such an improvised buoy could keep one person with a rifle afloat. This method required skill. It was necessary to lie on the raft on one's chest and, using one's arms and legs, swim to the opposite bank. The cold autumn water and constant shelling made this crossing a deadly dangerous undertaking. Sometimes car tires were used to make rafts, if they could be found. Several tires tied together and covered with boards were turned into a kind of catamaran. These were more reliable and could carry more cargo. Engineering units also showed remarkable ingenuity. They built ferries using boats provided by the local population. Several boats were connected together with wooden planks to form a platform for transporting light artillery and mortars. Rocket artillery, such as the famous Katyusha, was one of the most effective weapons of World War II. However, the launchers were complex to manufacture and were mounted on truck chassis. German engineers found a way to make rocket artillery much simpler, cheaper, and more accessible. They created heavy rocket mines with a caliber of 280 and 320 millimeters. Initially, these mines were launched from simple wooden or metal boxes. It was simple, but not very mobile or accurate. Soon, soldiers in the field began to install frames with these rockets on a wide variety of equipment. But the most successful carrier turned out to be the standard KFZ, 251 half-track armored personnel carrier. This combination was unofficially named Stuka zu Fuß, Stuka on foot, by analogy with the famous dive bomber. The design was extremely simple. 6 frames were attached to the sides of the armored personnel carrier, 3 on each side. These frames were loaded with rocket mines in their launch containers. Guidance was achieved by turning the entire vehicle horizontally and changing the angle of the launch frames vertically. It was crude, but quite sufficient for firing at large areas. The salvo from such a vehicle had a powerful explosive and psychological effect. The main advantage was mobility. The armored personnel carrier could quickly move into firing position, fire a salvo, and just as quickly change location, avoiding return fire. It was the ideal tactic for support weapons. This improvised multiple launch rocket system became very popular with German troops. It was cheap, easy to manufacture, and did not require a special chassis. Any standard armored personnel carrier could be converted into a rocket mortar right in the field workshop. The American Willis Jeep is rightly considered one of the symbols of World War II. But the standard vehicle was only a starting point for the boundless imagination of soldiers. American soldiers, known for their love of technology, turned the Jeep into a universal vehicle capable of performing dozens of different tasks. One of the most common modifications was turning the Jeep into a fire support vehicle. Large-caliber Browning M2 machine guns were mounted on it, making it a formidable opponent for infantry and even light armored vehicles. Such jeeps were used for combat reconnaissance and patrolling. In field hospitals, jeeps were converted into ambulances. Special brackets allowed stretchers with the wounded to be placed on top of the hood and rear of the body. This made it possible to quickly evacuate up to 3 wounded soldiers from the battlefield at the same time. Engineering units also got involved. Jeeps were equipped with small plows for laying communication cables. Other vehicles were equipped with engine-powered welding machines, turning them into mobile repair shops. Perhaps the most unusual modification was the railway jeep. By replacing the usual wheels with special steel ones with flanges, soldiers turned it into a light draisine. Such a jeep locomotive could patrol the railroad tracks or pull small supply carts. For operations deep behind enemy lines, jeeps were equipped with additional fuel and water tanks, similar to those used by British commandos. Everything unnecessary was removed from them to make the design as light as possible and increase the range. These were ideal vehicles for reconnaissance and sabotage. In the Pacific theater of war, where water obstacles often had to be crossed, amphibious jeeps appeared. Although there was a factory model for GPA, soldiers often sealed the body and engine of a standard Willys themselves, creating their own floating vehicles. Some craftsmen managed to install light recoilless guns or even missile launchers on jeeps. Each such modification was a response to a specific tactical task that needed to be solved here and now. We have looked at just 9 striking examples of how soldiers' ingenuity changed the face of war. Behind each of these creations, from the Na-E-Soup tank to the multifaceted Willys, there is something more than just a technical solution. It is a story about the human capacity for adaptation and an unyielding will to live. These homemade machines show the unvarnished human side of war. They demonstrate that behind every grand strategy and movement of the front lines were millions of personal, small battles. In these battles, soldiers relied not only on orders and standard weapons, but also on their own hands and minds. Resourcefulness became as important a resource as ammunition or food. The ability to turn a tractor into a tank or a truck into an all-terrain vehicle could save a garrison or ensure the success of an offensive. These skills were passed down from veterans to recruits, becoming part of the unwritten soldier's code. Many of these makeshift solutions were extremely dangerous for their creators and crews. Boiler steel armor was no match for factory-made armor, and homemade vehicles often broke down at the most inopportune moments. But when the choice was between enormous risk and certain death, soldiers chose risk. These objects prove that war is not only destruction. Paradoxically, in extreme conditions, it generates a surge of creative energy. People on the brink of survival begin to think differently, finding ingenious solutions in the simplest things. They remind us of the price of peace and the incredible efforts it took to achieve victory. Behind every detail of these crude, hastily welded machines lies someone's hope, someone's sweat, and someone's desire to return home. And that, perhaps, is the main lesson of their story. We conclude our journey into the world of homemade World War II vehicles. These amazing constructions made of metal, wood, and faith are not just technical curiosities. They are material evidence that the main weapon in any war is always the human being, his mind, courage, and ingenuity. They show that the history of war is not only the history of generals and armies, but also the history of nameless engineers in soldiers' greatcoats. Everyone who turned a tractor into a tank or a jeep into an armored vehicle made their own unique contribution to the overall victory, proving that the human spirit is capable of miracles even in the most unimaginable conditions. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. Which of these homemade machines impressed you the most? Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our new explorations of the hidden pages of history.